Muhammad. Ahmed, the camel driver who became the prophet of the Arabian desert, and whose followers almost conquered the entire known world for the greater glory of Allah, the only true God. Since the days of Carthage and Hannibal, we've said nothing of the Semitic people. You'll remember how they filled all the chapters devoted to the story of the ancient world. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, the Jews, the Armenians, the Chaldeans, all of them Semites, had been the rulers of Western Asia for 30 or 40 centuries. They had been conquered by the Indo-European Persians, who had come from the east, by the Indo-European Greeks, who had come from the west. 100 years after the death of Alexander the Great, Carthage, a colony of Semitic Phoenicians, had fought the Indo-European Romans for the mastery of the Mediterranean. Carthage had been defeated and destroyed, and for 800 years the Romans had been masters of the world. In the 7th century, however, another Semitic tribe appeared upon the scene and challenged the power of the West. They were the Arabs, peaceful shepherds who had roamed through the desert since the beginning of time, without showing any signs of imperial ambitions. Then they listened to Muhammad, mounted their horses, and in less than a century they had pushed to the heart of Europe and proclaimed the glories of Allah, the only God, and Muhammad, the prophet of the only God, to the frightened peasants of France. The story of Ahmed, the son of Abdallah, and Amina, usually known as Muhammad or He Who Will Be Praised, reads like a chapter in the 1001 Nights. He was a camel driver born in Mecca. He seems to have been an elliptic, and he suffered from spells of unconsciousness when he dreamed strange dreams and heard the voice of the angel Gabriel, whose words were afterwards written down in a book called the Quran. His work as a caravan dealer carried him all over Arabia, and he was constantly falling in with Jewish merchants and with Christian traders, and he came to see that the worship of a single God was a very excellent thing. His own people, the Arabs, still revered queer stones and trunks of trees as their ancestors had done tens of thousands of years before. In Mecca, their holy city, stood a little square building, the Kaaba, full of idols and strange odds and ends of hoodoo worship. Muhammad decided to be the Moses of the Arab people. He could not well be a prophet and a camel driver at the same time, so he made himself independent by marrying his employer, the rich widow Shadia. Then he told his neighbors in Mecca that he was the long-expected prophet sent by Allah to save the world. The neighbors laughed most heartily, and when Muhammad continued to annoy them with his speeches, they decided to kill him. They regarded him as a lunatic and a public bore who deserved no mercy. Muhammad heard of a plot, and in the dark of the night he fled to Medina together with Abu Bakr, his trusted pupil. This happened in the year 622. It is the most important date in Mahdian history and is known as the Hijra, the year of the Great Flight. In Medina, Muhammad, who was a stranger, found it easier to proclaim himself a prophet than in his home city, where everyone had known him as a simple camel driver. Soon he was surrounded by an increasing number of followers, or Muslims who accepted the Islam, the submission of the will of God, which Muhammad praised as the highest of all virtues. For 7 years he preached to the people of Medina. Then he believed himself strong enough to begin a campaign against his former neighbors who had dared to sneer at him in his holy mission in his old camel driving days. At the head of an army of Medinees, he marched across the desert. His followers took Mecca without great difficulty, and having slaughtered a number of the inhabitants, they found it quite easy to convince the others that Muhammad was really a great prophet. From that time on until the year of his death, Muhammad was fortunate in everything he undertook. There are 2 reasons for the success of Islam. In the first place, the creed which Muhammad taught to his followers was very simple. The disciples were told that they must love Allah, the ruler of the world, the merciful and compassionate. They must honor and obey their parents. They were warned against dishonesty in dealing with their neighbors, and were admonished to be humble and charitable to the poor and to the sick. Finally, they were ordered to abstain from strong drink and to be very frugal in what they ate. That was all. There were no priests who acted as shepherds of her flock and asked what they be supported at the common expense. The Mohammedan churches or mosques were merely large stone halls without benches or pictures, where the faithful could gather if they felt so inclined to read and discuss chapters from the Quran, the holy book. But the average Mohammedan carried his religion with him and never felt himself hemmed in the restrictions and regulations of an established church. 5 times a day he turned his face towards Mecca, the holy city, and said a simple prayer. For the rest of the time he let Allah rule the world, and as he saw fit, and accepted whatever fate brought him with patient resignation. Of course, such an attitude towards life did not encourage the faithful to go forth and invent electrical machinery or bother about railroads and steamship lines. But it gave every Mohammedan a certain amount of contentment. It bade him be at peace with himself and the world in which he lived, and that was a very good thing. The second reason, which explains the success of Muslims in their warfare upon the Christians, had to do with the conduct of the Mohammedan soldiers who went forth to do battle for the true faith. The Prophet promised that those who fell facing the enemy would go directly to heaven. This made sudden death in the field preferable to a long but dreary existence upon this earth. It gave the Mohammedans an enormous advantage over the Crusaders, who were in constant dread of a dark hereafter, and who struck to the good things of this world as long as they possibly could. Incidentally, it explains why even today Muslim soldiers will charge in a fire of European machine guns quite indifferent to the fate that awaits them, and why they are such dangerous and persistent enemies. Having put his religious house in order, Muhammad now began to enjoy his power as the undisputed ruler of a large number of Arab tribes. But success has been the undoing of a large number of men who were great in the days of adversity. He tried to gain the goodwill of a rich people by a number of regulations which could appeal to those of wealth. He allowed the faithful to have 4 wives. As one wife was a costly investment in those olden days, when brides were brought directly from the parents, 4 wives became a positive luxury except to those who possessed camels and dromedaries and date orchards beyond the dreams of avarice. A religion which at first had been meant for the hardy hunters of the high-sky desert was gradually transformed to suit the needs of the smug merchants who believed in the bazaars of the cities. It was a regrettable change from the original program, and it did very little good to the cause of Mohammedanism. As for the Prophet himself, he went on preaching the truth of Allah and proclaiming new rules of conduct until he died, quite suddenly of a fever on June 17th of the year 632. His successor as caliph or leader of the Muslims was his father-in-law, Abu Bakr, who had been shared the early dangers of the Prophet's life. 2 years later, Abu Bakr died, and Omar ibn al-Khattab followed him. In less than 10 years, he conquered Egypt, Persia, Phoenicia, Syria, and Palestine, and made Damascus the capital of the first Muhammad world empire. Omar was succeeded by Ali, the husband of Muhammad's daughters, Fatima, but a quarrel broke out upon a point of Muslim doctrine, and Ali was murdered. After his death, the caliphate was made hereditary, and the later leaders of the faithful who had begun their career as the spiritual head of a religious sect became the rulers of a vast empire. They built a new city on the shores of Euphrates, near the ruins of Babylon, and called it Baghdad. In organizing the Arab horsemen into regiments of cavalry, they set forth to bring the happiness of their Muslim faith to all unbelievers. In the year 700 AD, a Mohammedan general by the name of Tariq crossed the old gates of Hercules and reached a high rock on the European side which he called the Gibel al-Tariq, the hill of Tariq of Gibraltar. 11 years later, in the Battle of Xerxes de la Frontera, he defeated the king of Visigoths, and then the Muslim army moved northward, and following the route of Hannibal, they crossed the passes of the Pyrenees. They defeated the Duke of Aquincum, who tried to halt them near Bordeaux, and marched upon Paris. But in the year 732, 100 years after the death of the prophet, they were beaten in the battle between Tours and Poitiers. On that day, Charles Martel, Charles with the Hammer, the Frankish chieftain, saved Europe from a Mohammedan conquest. He drove the Muslims out of France, but they maintained themselves in Spain, where Abd ar-Rahman founded the Caliphate of Cordova, which became the greatest center of science and art of medieval Europe. This Moorish kingdom, so called because the people came from Mauritania and Morocco, lasted 7 centuries. It was only after the capture of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold near 1492, that Columbus received the royal grant which allowed him to go upon a voyage of discovery. The Mohammedans soon regained their strength, and the new conquest which they made in Asia and Africa, and today, there are as many followers of Muhammad as there are of Christ. Charlemagne. How Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, came to bear the title of emperor and try to revive the old ideal of world empire. The Battle of Poitiers had saved Europe from the Mohammedans, but the enemy within, the hopeless disorder which had followed the disappearance of a Roman police officer, that enemy remained. It is true that the new converts on the Christian faith in northern Europe felt a deep respect for the mighty Bishop of Rome. But that poor bishop did not feel any too safe when he looked toward the distant mountains. Heaven knew what fresh hordes of barbarians were ready to cross the Alps and begin a new attack on Rome. It was necessary, very necessary, for the spiritual head of the world to find an ally with a strong sword and a powerful fist who was willing to defend his holiness in case of danger. And so the popes, who were not only very holy, but also very practical, cast about for a friend, and presently they made overtures to the most promising of the Germanic tribes, who had occupied northwestern Europe after the fall of Rome. They were called the Franks. One of their earliest kings, called Merovec, had helped the Romans in a battle of Catalaunian fields in the year 451, when they defeated the Huns. His descendants, the Merovingians, had continued to take little bits of imperial territory until the year 486, when King Clovis, the old French word for Louis, felt himself strong enough to beat the Romans in the open. But his descendants were weak, men who left the affairs of state to their prime minister, the major domus, or master of the palace. Pepin the Short, the son of a famous Charles Martel, who succeeded his father as master of a palace, hardly knew how to handle this situation. His royal master was a devout theologian without any interest in politics. Pepin asked the Pope for advice. The Pope was a practical person, answered that the power in the state belonged to him who was actually possessed of it. Pepin took the hint. He persuaded Childeric, the last of the Merovingians, to become a monk, and then made himself king with the approval of other Germanic chieftains. But this did not satisfy the shrewd Pepin. He wanted to be something more than a barbarian chieftain. He staged an elaborate ceremony at which Boniface, the great missionary of the European Northwest, anointed him, and made him a king by the grace of God. It was easy to slip those words, Dei Gratia, into the coronation service. It took almost 1,500 years to get them out again. Pepin was sincerely grateful for this kindness on the part of the church. He made 2 expeditions to Italy to defend the Pope against his enemies. He took Ravenna and several other cities away from the Longobards and presented them to His Holiness, who incorporated these new domains into the so-called Papal State, which remained an independent country like half a century ago. After Pepin's death, the relations between Rome and Aix-la-Chapelle, or Nieuwegeem, or Ingelheim, the Frankish kings did not have one official residence, but traveled from place to place with all their ministers and court officers, became more and more cordial. Finally, the Pope and the King took a step which was to influence the history of Europe in a most profound way. Charles, commonly known as Carolus Magnus, or Charlemagne, succeeded Pepin in the year 768. He had conquered the land of the Saxons in eastern Germany, and had built towns and monasteries all over the greater part of northern Europe. At the request of certain enemies of Abd ar-Rahman, he had invaded Spain to fight the Moors. But in the Pyrenees, he had been attacked by the wild Basques and had been forced to retire. It was upon this occasion that Roland, the great Margrave of Breton, forced what a Frankish chieftain of those early days meant when he promised to be faithful to his king, and gave his life and that of his trusted followers to safeguard the retreat of the royal army. During the last 10 years of the 8th century, however, Charles was obliged to devote himself exclusively to affairs of the south. The Pope Leo III had been attacked by a band of Roman rowdies and had been left for dead in the street. Some kind people had bandaged his wounds and had helped him to escape to the camp of Charles, where he asked for help. An army of Franks soon restored quiet and carried Leo back to Lateran Palace, which ever since the days of Constantine had been the home of the Pope. That was in December of the year 799. On Christmas Day the next year, Charlemagne, who was staying in Rome, attended the service in the ancient church of St. Peter. When he arose from prayer, the Pope placed a crown upon his head, called him Emperor of the Romans, and hailed him once more with the title of Augustus, which had not been heard for hundreds of years. Once more, Northern Europe was part of a Roman Empire, but the dignity was held by a German chieftain who could read just as little and never learned to write. But he could fight. For a short while there was order, and even the rival emperor in Constantinople sent a letter of approval to his dear brother. Unfortunately, the splendid old man died in the year 814. His sons and grandsons at once began to fight for the largest share of the imperial inheritance. Twice, the Carolingians' lands were divided by the treaties of Verdun in the year 843 and the Treaty of Mersin on the Meuse in the year 870. The latter treaty divided the entire Frankish kingdom into two parts. Charles the Bold received the western half. It contained the old Roman province called Gaul, where the language of the people had become thoroughly Romanized. The Franks soon learned to speak their language, and this account for the strange fact that a purely Germanic land like France should speak a Latin tongue. The other grandson got the eastern part, the land which the Romans called Germania. Those inhospitable regions had never been part of the old empire. Augustus had tried to conquer this far east, but his legions had been annihilated in the Tubarong Wood in the year 9, and the people had never been influenced by the higher Roman civilization. They spoke the popular Germanic tongue. The Teuton word for people was fiat. The Christian missionaries therefore called the German language the lingua fiotisca, or the lingua tuistica. The popular dialect, and this word tutisca has changed in Deutsch, which accounts for the name Deutschland. As for the famous imperial crown, it very soon slipped off the heads of the Carolingian successors and rolled back onto the Italian plain, where it became a sort of plaything of a number of little potents who stole the crown from each other amidst of much bloodshed and wore it, with or without the permission of a pope, until it was the turn of some ambitious neighbor. The Pope, once more sorely beset by his enemies, sent north for help. He did not appeal to the ruler of the West Frankish kingdom this time. His messengers crossed the Alps and addressed themselves to Odo, a Saxon prince who was recognized as the greatest chieftain of the different Germanic tribes. Odo, who shared his people's affection for the blue skies and the gay and beautiful people of the Italian peninsula, hastened to the rescue. In return for his services, the Pope Leo VIII made Odo emperor, and the eastern half of Charles' old kingdom was henceforth known as the Holy Roman Empire of a German nation. This strange political creation managed to live to the ripe old age of 839 years. In the year 1801, during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, it was most unceremoniously relegated to the historical scrap heap. The brutal fellow who destroyed the old Germanic Empire was the son of a Corsican notary public who had made a brilliant career in the service of the French Republic. He was ruler of Europe by the grace of his famous guard regiments, but he desired to do something more. He sent to Rome for the Pope, and the Pope came and stood by while General Napoleon placed the imperial crown upon his own head and proclaimed himself heir to the tradition of Charlemagne. For history is like life. The more things change, the more they remain the same. The Norsemen. Why the people of the 10th century prayed the Lord to protect them from the fury of the Norsemen. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Germanic tribes of Central Europe had broken through the defenses of the empire that they might plunder Rome and live on the fat of the land. In the 8th century, it became the turn of the Germans to be the plundered ones. They did not like this at all. Even if their enemies were their first cousins, the Norsemen who lived in Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. What forced these hardy sailors to turn pirate, we do not know. But once they had discovered the advantages and pleasures of a buccaneering career, there was no one who could stop them. They would suddenly descend upon a peaceful Frankish or Frisian village situated on the mouth of a river. They would kill all the men and steal all the women. Then they would sail away in their fast-sailing ships, and when the soldiers of the king or emperor arrived upon the scene, the robbers were gone and nothing remained but a few smoldering ruins. During the days of disorder which followed the death of Charlemagne, the Northmen developed great activity. Their fleets made raids upon every country, and their sailors established small independent kingdoms along the coast of Holland and France, and England and Germany. And they even found their way into Italy. The Northmen were very intelligent. They soon learned to speak the language of their subjects, and gave up the uncivilized ways of the early Vikings or Sea Kings, who had been very picturesque but also very unwashed and terribly cruel. Early in the 10th century, a Viking by the name of Rollo had repeatedly attacked the coast of France. The king of France, too weak to resist these northern robbers, tried to bribe them into being good. He offered them the province of Normandy if they would promise to stop bothering the rest of his domains. Rollo accepted this bargain and became Duke of Normandy. But the passion of conquest was strong in the blood of his children. Across the channel, only a few hours away from the European mainland, they could see the white cliffs and the green fields of England. Poor England had passed through difficult days. For 200 years it had been a Roman colony. After the Romans left, it had been conquered by the Angles and the Saxons, 2 German tribes from Schleswig. Next, the Danes had taken the greater part of the country and had established a kingdom of Knut. The Danes had been driven away, and now it was early in the 11th century, another Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, was on the throne. But Edward was not expected to live long, and he had no children. The circumstances favored the ambitious Dukes of Normandy. In 1066, Edward died. Immediately, William of Normandy crossed the Channel, defeated and killed Harold of Wessex, who had taken the crown at the Battle of Hastings, and proclaimed himself King of England. In another chapter I've told you now in the year 800, a German chieftain had become a Roman emperor. Now in the year 1066, the grandson of Norse pirate was recognized as King of England. Why should we ever read fairy stories when the truth of history is so much more interesting and entertaining? Feudalism. How Central Europe, attacked from 3 sides, became an armed camp, and and why Europe would have perished without those professional soldiers and administrations who were part of a feudal system. The following, then, is the state of Europe in the year of 1000, when most people were so unhappy that they welcomed a prophecy foretelling the approaching end of the world and rushed to the monasteries that the day of judgment might find them engaged upon devout duties. At an unknown date, the Germanic tribes had left their old home in Asia and had moved westward into Europe. By sheer pressure of numbers, they had forced their way into the Roman Empire. They had destroyed the great Western Empire, but the eastern part, being off the main route of the greatest migrations, had managed to survive and feebly continued the traditions of Rome's ancient glory. During the days of disorder which had followed, the true dark ages of history, the 6th and 7th centuries of our era, the German tribes had been persuaded to accept the Christian religion and had recognized a bishop of Rome as the Pope or spiritual head of the world. In the 9th century, the organizing genius of Charlemagne had a revival of the Roman Empire and had united the greater part of Western Europe into a single state. During the 10th century, this empire had gone to pieces. The western part had become a separate kingdom, France. The eastern half was known as the Holy Roman Empire of a German nation, and the rulers of this federation of states then pretended that they were the direct heirs of Caesar and Augustus. Unfortunately, the power of the kings of France did not stretch beyond the moat of their royal residence, while the Holy Roman Emperor was openly defied by his powerful subjects whenever it suited their fancy or their profit. To increase the misery of the masses of the people, the triangle of Western Europe was forever exposed to attacks from three sides. On the south lived the ever-dangerous Mohammeds. The western coast was ravaged by the Norsemen, the eastern frontier defenseless except for the short stretch of the Carpathian Mountains, was at the mercy of the hordes of the Huns, Hungarians, Slavs, and Tartars. The peace of Rome was a thing of a remote past, a dream of the good old days that were gone forever. It was a question of fight or die, and quite naturally people preferred to fight. Forced by circumstances, Europe became an armed camp and there was a demand for strong leadership. Both king and emperor were far away. The frontiersmen, and most of Europe in the year 1000 was frontier, must help themselves. They willingly submitted to the representatives of the king, who were sent to administer the outlying districts, provided they could protect them against their enemies. Soon Central Europe was dotted with small principalities, each one ruled by a duke, or a count, or a baron, or a bishop, as the case might be, and organized as a fighting unit. These dukes and counts and barons had sworn to be faithful to the king who had given their feudum, hence our word feudal, in return for their loyal services and a certain amount of taxes. But travel in those days was slow and the means of communication were exceedingly poor. The royal or imperial administrations therefore enjoyed great independence, and within the boundaries of their own province, they assumed most of the rights which in truth belonged to the king. But you would make a mistake if you suppose that the people of the 11th century objected to this form of government. They supported feudalism because it was a very practical and necessary institution. Their lord and master usually lived in a big stone house erected on the top of a steep rock or built between deep moats, but within sight of the subjects. In case of danger, the subjects found shelter behind the walls of a baronial stronghold. That is why they tried to live as near the castle as possible, and accounts for the many European cities which begin their career around a feudal fortress. But the knight of the early Middle Ages was much more than a professional soldier. He was the civil servant of the day. He was the judge of his community, and he was the chief of police. He caught the highwaymen and protected the wandering peddlers, who were the merchants of the 11th century. He looked after the dislikes so that the countryside should not be flooded, just as the first nobleman had done in the valley of the Nile 4,000 years before. He encouraged the troubadours who wandered from place to place telling the stories of the ancient heroes who had fought in the great wars of the migrations. Besides, he protected the churches and the monasteries within his territory, and although he could neither read nor write, it was considered unmanly to know such things. He employed a number of priests who kept his accounts, and who registered the marriages and the births and the deaths which occurred within the baronial or ducal domains. In the 15th century, the kings once more became strong enough to exercise those powers which belonged to them because they were anointed of God. Then the feudal knights lost their former independence. Reduced to the rank of county squires, they no longer filled a need, and soon they became a nuisance. But Europe would have perished without the feudal system of the Dark Ages. There were many bad knights as there are many bad people today, but generally speaking, the rough-fisted barons of the 12th and 13th century were hard-working and administrators who rendered a most useful service to the cause of progress. During that era, the noble torch of learning and art which had illuminated the world of the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans was burning very low. Without the knights and their good friends, the monks, civilization would have been extinguished entirely, and the human race would have been forced to begin once more where the caveman had left off. Chivalry. It was quite natural that the professional fighting men of the Middle Ages should try to establish some sort of organization for their mutual benefit and protection. Out of this need for close organization, knighthood or chivalry was born. We know very little about the origins of knighthood. But as the system developed, it gave the world something which it needed very badly, a definite rule of conduct which softened the barbarous customs of that day and made life more livable than it had been during the 500 years of the Dark Ages. It was not an easy task to civilize the rough frontiersmen who had spent most of their time fighting Mohammeds and Huns and Norsemen. Often they were guilty of backsliding, and having vowed all sorts of oaths about mercy and charity in the morning, they would murder all their prisoners before evening. But progress is ever the result of slow and ceaseless labor, and finally the most unscrupulous of knights was forced to obey the rules of his class, or suffer the consequences. The rules were different in the various parts of Europe, but they all made mouth of service and loyalty to duty. The Middle Ages regarded service as something very noble and beautiful. It was no disgrace to be a servant provided you were a good servant and did not slacken on the job. As for loyalty, at a time when life depended upon the faithful performance of many unpleasant duties, it was the chief virtue of a fighting man. A young knight, therefore, was asked to swear that he would be faithful as a servant to God, and as a servant to his king. Furthermore, he promised to be generous to those whose need was greater than his own. He pledged his word that he would be humble in his personal behavior, and would never boast of his own accomplishments, and that he would be a friend of all those who suffered, with the exception of the Mohammedans, whom he had expected to kill on sight. Around these vows, which were merely the 10 Commandments expressed in terms which the people of the Middle Ages could understand, there developed a complicated system of manners and outward behavior. The knights tried to model their own lives after the example of those heroes of Arthur's Round Table and Charlemagne's court, to whom the Traubanders had told them, of whom you may read in the delightful books which are enumerated at the end of this volume. They hoped that they might prove as brave as Lancelot and as faithful as Roland. They carried themselves with dignity, and they spoke careful and gracious words that they might be known as true knights, however humble the cut of their coat or the size of their purse. In this way, the order of knighthood became a school of those good manners which are the oil of the social machinery. Chivalry came to mean courtesy, and the feudal castle showed the rest of the world what clothes to wear, how to eat, how to ask a lady for a dance, and 1,001 little things of everyday behavior which helped to make life interesting and agreeable. Like all human institutions, knighthood was doomed to perish as soon as it had outlived its usefulness. The Crusaders, about which one of the next chapter tells were followed by a great revival of trade. Cities grew overnight. The townspeople became rich, hired good school teachers, and soon were the equals of the knights. The invention of gunpowder deprived the heavily armed chevalier of his former advantage, and the use of mercenaries made it impossible to conduct a battle without the delicate necessities of a chess tournament. The knight became superfluous. Soon he became a ridiculous figure with his devotion to ideals that had no longer any practical value. It was said that the noble Don Guido de la Mancha had been the last of the true knights. After his death, his trusted sword and his armor were sold to pay his debts. But somehow or other, that sword seems to have fallen into the hands of a number of men. Washington carried it during the hopeless days of Valley Forge. It was the only defense of Gordon when he had refused to desert the people who had been entrusted to his care and stayed to meet his death in the besieged fortress of Khartoum. And I am not quite sure that it provided of invaluable strength in winning the Great War.